So in the past couple lectures, we looked at radicalism as it was present in the civil rights movement, as well as in the student who left. And today we're going to look at the family and the changes that took place in the family as a result of the 1960s. First, let's treat the liberal family from the 1940s and the 1950s. The liberals had an understanding of traditional gender roles in marriage. The divorce rate was very low compared to today's standards. There was a spike in the divorce rate during World War II and after World War II. But afterwards, the divorce rate went back down to around 20%. That's where it lingered from the late 50s into the early 60s and even declined in some places. The illegitimacy rate was very low, something around 4% in the late 50s and the early 60s. There were many women who were very unsatisfied with their status and the gender roles of liberal society. This was captured in a book written by Betty Friedan in the early 60s, The Feminine Mystique. Friedan had pointed out early on in the book that there was a hierarchy of honor and shame that directed women's behavior towards certain gender roles, namely that of being a wife and a mother. Every society that's well-ordered will operate with a currency of honor and shame for men and also for women. And honor and shame is the reward that they receive for performing certain functions or tasks. Friedan had noted that for very ambitious women, they were shamed if they decided to have a full-time career. She points out how in women's journals, women who decided they should run a business or they wanted to climb high in a corporate hierarchy were treated as if they were sexually frigid or if they had daddy issues, a kind of psychoanalytic interpretation that would shame those very ambitious women. And it was women that were doing the shaming. It was wives and mothers who frowned upon those women who had careers. And so she, borrowing from W.B. Du Bois, his idea of a double consciousness, argued that women's perceptions of themselves were coming through the broader society, and they needed a revolutionary way of viewing themselves. And so the feminine mystique was about celebrating women who could become full persons, and she's borrowing from Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So again, what she's saying is that women who are wives and mothers are not complete human beings, that they need a career outside of the home in order to fulfill themselves. One of the obvious places that we see these gender roles in mid-century liberal society is in the occupations that women had. It was not odd for women to take jobs outside of the home, but they were very much attached to their sex. So one of those jobs was the job of stewardess. And if you were a stewardess and you were a woman, it was safe to bet that when you reached the age of 30, you might lose your job. You were hired explicitly because that you were beautiful and you were thin. And these are the things that Betty Friedan challenged. Radical feminism doesn't begin with Betty Friedan. She was viewed as being somewhat liberal or centrist. Radical feminism began with the student new left. As students traveled down into the South to work in the civil rights movement, many of the females noticed that they were performing the traditional functions in the civil rights houses they were staying at. While they were staying with men in those houses or they were meeting with men, they realized it was their job to make the coffee. When it came time to collaborating, it was men who always had the leadership positions, who got to speak in the meetings. They were often spoken down. And so the radical feminist began to wonder, why is it that we are searching for freedom for blacks in the South when we as white women don't possess those same freedoms or equality with white men in the North and all around the country? And so in 1965, Casey Hayden, Tom Hayden's wife at the time, and Mary King wrote an essay called Sex and Caste. And in that essay, they argued that women were actually a caste that was below men in American society. This was followed up by other essays, such as one in the 1967 New Left Notes. It argued that women were a colonized people, just as peoples of color were colonized in the Third World. And so the solution for radical feminists was to point out systemic injustices. And here again, we see C. Wright Mill's idea of the personal politics. In fact, Carol Hannish in 1969 would write an essay on the personal is the political, and the political is the personal. Gloria Steinem would say that women actually had the status of chattel slaves in American society. Hayden and King pointed out that appeals to biology, they didn't deny that there were biological differences, but they said that appeals to biology only justified the subordinated role that women played in a society. They said that in order to be liberated, men and women would have to transcend their gender roles and for all of them to live as whole human beings instead of halves of human beings divided by their sex roles. And so the solution would then be consciousness raising. And radical feminists, by the end of the 1960s, would gather together and they would, as they would say, rap. And they would talk about their personal problems. They would talk about their grievances that they had in their relationships with their husbands or boyfriends, such as the husband comes home and he is not picking up the house. He doesn't pick up the toys. He doesn't help with the dishes. He doesn't help do the housework. He doesn't crush up the pizza box and put it into the trash. And in consciousness raising, the idea is to point out that personal problem and say, the problem is not that your husband is a slob or that he's not thoughtful. The problem is he sees himself as part of a master caste in a patriarchal system. And so now all of a sudden, here's a quote from Jane O'Reilly's A Housewife's Moment of Truth. Now all of a sudden, all of those small experiences that you've had as a woman begin to make sense. And now all of those experiences are fit within the broader system of the patriarchy. And that's the power of feminism as this metaphysical system. It helps to explain the world. And so with consciousness raising, women would become aware that they were not alone in their personal problems. Rather, they were unified with all other women in what was called the sisterhood. There's a wonderful anthology of 1970 edited by Robin Morgan called Sisterhood is Powerful. One of the things women would discover is that the patriarchy may be the longest standing form of oppression among human beings, that it went back some 2,000 years, even to primordial society. It was a form of oppression, interestingly, not just for women, where they were subordinated to certain caste roles, but also to men. Warren Farrell's made a whole career talking about the male myth. Gloria Steinem talked about straitjacketing, where men are forced to be in a position where they're not allowed to cry. They have to be emotionally independent. They believe they have to be a breadwinner as opposed to having a relationship with a strong female who could also play those roles in their relationship. There were various strains of feminism. In fact, there's whole PhDs that you can earn in women's studies. We can't even begin to get into the labyrinth of women's studies here. But interestingly, you find the argument for a kind of gender fluidity early on, say 1970. Shulamith-Firestone's 1970 Dialectic of Sex sees the problem not as simply tied to female gender roles, but rather to female biology. She argued that the biological fact that women bear children has put them in this subordinate place. And so the solution would be the use of technology. Technology would enable women to transcend sex altogether. She says children someday will be born artificially. Motherhood would be replaced by, quote, professional foster parents. There were some women, if you read some of the radical magazines like the Berkeley Tribe in 1970-71, who are talking about unisex bathrooms. They talk about a, quote, end to segregation in the bathroom. Now, this did not represent most women. Most women did not want a genderless society. But rather, they wanted freedom from some of the old gender roles. They wanted to pursue occupations. I would submit that the myth of feminism is that it was a battle against men or a battle against the patriarchy. Rather, it seems to me that it was a battle between what we'd call the sisterhood or the radical feminists and women who had traditional roles. In other words, it was really a battle over what women would honor among themselves between female elites and the old liberal middle class. Feminist elites were very successful in inverting the hierarchy. The way that Betty Friedan described women who did not have careers is that they were language-caged birds, not even fully human. In fact, there ought to be some kind of a shame. We see that somewhat today if you ask a woman what her job is and she says, I'm just a stay-at-home mom, where there's the idea she hasn't really fulfilled herself or that she's just chosen to be lazy as a mode of living. One of the views of the feminists is that motherhood should be on equal status or even subordinated to economic production. Gloria Steinem said that the liberal mothers and housewives were too concerned that they would be separated from their children, that there would be some kind of damage that they inflicted. She said, quote, "The ultimate myth is that children must have full-time mothers and that liberated women make bad ones." And so Steinem argued there'd be a new model of the family built on the ashes of the old. And I think that's important. There needed to be a destruction of the patriarchal family as a form of oppression and the roles that women and children played in the patriarchal family. What would the new model be? Steinem suggests various models, but essentially it meant you might have polyamorous relationships, you might have serial monogamy throughout your 20s, get married in your early 30s, and have 1.3 kids. But these were all different forms of the family, and we shouldn't privilege one particular view, and in fact, that older model of the family itself as oppressive ought to be destroyed. One key element, Steinem said, for the new family was that women would be economically independent. They would not require a husband to provide their economic needs because that placed them in a subordinate position to men. And of course, it would also mean that women needed to have full control over their reproductive rights. They needed to have a right to an abortion and free access to contraception if sex wasn't to be plagued with an anxiety that they would have to pay the full price in bearing a child. What were some of the new rights that the radical feminists crusaded for, that they said were necessary for their individual liberation? Free contraception, abortion. There were early abortion laws passed in states like New York before Roe v. Wade in 1973. The feminists argued for a universal daycare, where the government would provide daycare so that women could go to work and liberate themselves. Probably the most important development that we see and the change that has had the greatest impact in American society is the introduction of what we call no-fault divorce, or irreconcilable differences. Many of the radicals in law, and this includes the American Bar Association, had argued for a new uniform divorce law that would be adopted by states that would introduce irreconcilable differences so that couples wouldn't feel trapped in marriage. Every state except one passes a no-fault divorce law by the middle of the 80s, and it begins in the end of the 60s, 1970, this move. One of the key figures here was Herma Hill Kay. Herma Hill Kay argued that no-fault divorce was essential for liberating women from the patriarchal family. She pointed out things like women having to move to the states where their husbands took jobs, having to take on their husbands' names, but also the idea of divorce as a form of personal liberation. After the passing of the no-fault divorce laws, the divorce rate spikes in the United States. In the 1950s, 11% of the children born experienced divorce, often cited as the most traumatic event in a child's life. In the 1970s, 50% of children experienced a divorce, and into the 1980s, half of all marriages ended in divorce. What's interesting is that this new model of marriage tended to benefit an elite class of women. The National Organization for Women tended to focus on lobbying for, quote, career advancement for these elite women and their sexual and reproductive rights. Many of the middle class and lower class women felt forgotten. A great essay for understanding this new class divide is Susan Jacoby's 1973 The Flatbush Feminists. In this essay, she describes the existential crises of blue-collar women in Flatbush. The essay begins, "I'm short, fat, and 45. And there you find all of these middle-class women who feel the loss of sexual allure in a midlife crisis. They also feel that there's a loss of vocation as their children have left the home, and they're not sure what their vocation in life is. Instead of going to a priest or a pastor, they go to Ms. Magazine, which was founded in part by Gloria Steinem. And there they learn they need to start a consciousness-raising group. And the advice that's given to them is they need to take jobs outside the home. They were smart enough to know they weren't going to get 4-year degrees, but they could get some kind of a degree that would help them in clerical work to bring in a little bit more money. They could spice up their sex lives. They can go on an extra vacation. Most importantly, what they learn is to teach their daughters not to follow in the footsteps that they themselves had followed because they wouldn't be happy later on in life. That's a good example as to how we see social and cultural change. You have elite women who set a trend or a standard that's followed by middle class and working class women. Another example is the black feminist lesbian Combahee River Collective, which was formed in 1974. These were women who argued that they resided at the intersection of a multiplicity of oppressed groups, a, quote, whole range of oppressions. And that meant that as long as they were oppressed, Other groups were participating in their oppression and needed to become allies with them to liberate them. And until they themselves achieved autonomy and personhood, no one else in the society would truly be free. Importantly, elite males promoted feminism. If we look at Ted Kennedy, he obviously had an interest in D.C. in a de facto polygamy that was made possible by the sexual revolution. Birch Bayh drafted Title IX, that was the source of so many of the newfound rights for women in education. But also Ronald Reagan and Nelson Rockefeller, they supported abortion and no-fault divorce in California and in New York. In 1971, and here we see more support for feminism in Washington, D.C. and the federal government, Congress passed the Comprehensive Child Development Bill. This bill would fund daycare, after-school care centers. It would provide nutrition, counseling, even medical and dental care. This was only vetoed by Richard Nixon after pressure from Pat Buchanan. But in 1972, Congress supported the Equal Rights Amendment, which would do away with any distinction based on sex constitutionally. There wasn't much thought as to how women would not be included within the draft and other differences, for example, male and female bathrooms. But we find congressional support for the ERA. In 1977, when support for the ERA was flagging, Congress provided $5 million for the National Women's Conference. This was a ratification rally. There was actually a torch that was lit at Seneca Falls from 1848 in the Seneca Falls Conference, which many considered to be the beginning of feminism and the crusade for female suffrage. And the torch was passed all the way to Houston. There, former first ladies got up on the stage to promote the ERA, and the ratification rally resolved in favor of gay rights, government child care, and federal funding for an abortion, including for minors. The opposition to ERA was not led by men. It was led by Phyllis Schlafly, who was very much hated on the left. Phyllis Schlafly formed a coalition of homemakers, and particularly those in religious organizations. Homemakers saw their status threatened by feminism, and they argued for the continuance of those old roles that women played and the honor of those roles. And so Phyllis Schlafly, in many debates on television, would help to kill the ERA. It came down to a final vote and did not pass. But still, we find more government support for radical feminism. In 1979, in the White House Conference on Families, which was funded $3 million, 39 radicals and one conservative were selected to make proposals on how the U.S. could, quote, strengthen families. Gloria Steinem insisted on the use of the plural families because it would also include homosexual and extramarital families. And so we conclude with a treatment of the class divide that begins in the 1970s. Instead of living wage jobs, the functions of the home were replaced by service sector jobs. Many of the jobs that had been fulfilled in the home, raising children, preparing food, much of the medical care, and we find an increase in the divorce rate and an increase in the number of broken families. In many cases, the war on poverty and the sexual revolution subsidized the destruction of the middle-class family. Oftentimes, government agents advertising for welfare would go into black neighborhoods and remind women that they could only receive these payments if they were not married, thereby encouraging single motherhood. Importantly, women learned that they must have a career to be successful. Herma Hill-Kay argued that the problem was that, quote, mothers of young children are consistently the most underemployed. She added, quote, it is critical that major governmental planning be undertaken to devise ways of facilitating labor market entry and job continuity for these women. The new divorce laws that contributed to an increase in the divorce rate also had in hand the idea that women would enter into the workforce. Industrial jobs were shrinking as a share of the economy. Women entered the workplace, driving down wages. In an odd situation, those same women were competing with high school educated men and competing for lower wages, driving down wages. We also find an increase in the number of immigrants, illegal and legal, also competing for those same wages. So women's income rose in the 1970s and the 80s, nearing that of high school graduates in the 80s, but working male wages declined. Insofar as women entered the workforce, they entered the new service sector economy in service jobs and in retail trade, which constituted 70% of private sector growth between 1973 and 1980, and 40% of those jobs were in food, health, and services. The economist Emma Rothschild described the new work. The women's work, she called it, quote, waiting on tables, defrosting frozen hamburgers, rendering service to buildings, looking after the old and the ill. Women constituted 89% of the workers in nursing and personal care, 56% of the workers in restaurants, and 81% of the workers in health services. They averaged $3.87 an hour in 1979, as opposed to $6.16 an hour in the private sector. And so we see that the cost paid for the advancement, the economic advancement, the career advancement of a relatively small number of women was that marriage was destroyed for most women. Now we find that a majority of adults are single, and marriage is considered to be a luxury. We find that a vast number of women would not choose to work a 40-hour work week, but are forced to because of the economic stresses they find upon themselves. And so feminism introduces a new class divide. It's probably best described in the words career and job. Women who go to college for many years, and the sexual revolution is a part of this, insofar as women are not going to be chaste and men are not going to be chaste, but need to go to college for an extra 7 or 8 years. That means that we have to give permissivity for the indiscretions that they're involved in, and they will have a series of serial monogamous relationships until they get married in their 30s, double income, no kids professionals. But many women entering the workforce would call their occupations not careers but jobs. These are low-paying, dead-end jobs. They will often choose to have children out of wedlock, increasingly have chosen to have children out of wedlock, to start families as the only possible families that they can have. In the next lecture, we'll look at this sexual revolution and how it changes an important role in the lives of American men and women.